Hey guys, this is W3C Ray, and today we want to talk about a new concept called bounty power. This concept is new because I created this concept, and the new concept is allowing you to decide very fast in game what the equity drop is caused by a player's bounty. So you look inside your HUD, look at the stat for a bounty power, which has a color coding. You see directly, okay, there is a huge pressure on the player because his bounty is big. And not only that, you see by the color coding already that you will have to take some focus now to the table because there's a bounty involved which wants to be hunted. You can use the stat directly to see how much equity drop is caused by the bounty. So you don't have to do any calculations anymore in your head. You can just use the stat, use the pop-up, then look inside of the drop-down menu and see, okay, this is the equity which I have to subtract from the equity given by the pot odds, and then I get the equity versus the opponent's range. I will introduce, of course, this concept inside of this video, and let's go right into this. So the problematic is that calculating odds in-game with an additional bounty involved in the head will take some time. So for example, a 20 big blind stack is jamming, we're sitting in the big blind and considering calling off the all-in. In this case, when a 20 big blind stack is jamming, then you're getting roughly 1.2 to 1, and in this case, you need round about 45% equity to call. And when a bounty is involved, so when you're playing a PKO, for example, then you will have to take the value of his bounty in chips. So first recalculate this in chips, then add this to the pot, then you're getting new pot odds, and then out of those new pot odds, you have to calculate the equity again. And this calculation in-game will take some time. And not only that you have to do the calculation, then you have to think about the range of the opponent and then translate the equity which you got in a range which you can call. And of course, this will take some time. And when you're like 2 or 4 tabling, this might not be a big issue because you got a lot of time. On the other tables, you don't have to do a lot. But when you're multi-tabling, so especially for multi-tabling, this can be very challenging. So if you're, for example, 10 or 15 tabling and have, for example, 2 decisions on 2 tables where a bounty is involved, you have to do very fast calculation in your head to be somehow accurate. And not only that you have to do all the calculation, the size of the bounty compared to the stack value has also a huge influence. So if you are facing a jam which contains already several starting stacks of the tournament, so for example the tournament started with 5k chips and someone jams 15,000 chips and he has 1.5 bounties, the equity drop caused by the bounty is totally different compared to the case where, for example, he's jamming 1.5 starting stacks but has 4 bounties. And this difference will be discussed also later on in the video. Little side note, not only that you have to do the calculation and translate the given equity then into a range, there might be other things which you want to think about. So for example, future EV on the table, or if players are sitting behind you, how their calling ranges might influence your calling range. Or probably it's already in the paid prices, so you have some ICM influence to consider, and so on. And every little time we take away from all the calculations you have to do in-game will give you essentially more time to think about other things which might be also very important. So our task will be to find a way to put all the needed informations in a simple number, and the simple number we will call bounty power. So the needed informations are stack size of the actual player, starting stack, actual bounty of the player, start bounty, how much did the tournament actually progress. So from the PKO video you should have learned that the progression of the bounty price pool, or the fact that I take some money out before, for example, the usual payouts for the tournament is starting, so at 12% players left or 10% players left, this progression has to be also taken into account, and we need to take all this information, so stage of the tournament, size of the bounty, size of the stack, into consideration, and we want to put this in one number, and this number should tell us, okay, if we have 1.2 to 1 odds, we need 45% equity in a non-KO case. How much equity should I take away of this 45% so that I get my needed equity in the case that the bounty is involved? And with a simple color coding, you should see directly how big the influence of the bounty is on your required equity. So not only that you have the option to see the equity which you have to subtract from the equity given by the pot odds, also we want by the color coding to set you into a position where you can see directly when you are multi-tabing, so playing a lot of tables, okay, from this opponent, his bounty compared to your stack size, has not such a huge benefit to hunt, but for this opponent, I really have to look into my ranges and look if I can call because I really can widen up my range and so on. Also, we want to give you the ability to see directly how much bounty pressure is on you. So how can you adapt your ranges if you have, for example, the right ratio between stack and bounty? Should I jam a combination more? Should I raise it? Should I open fold it? And so on. So the resulting bounty power number is given you in the end the equity which you will have to subtract from the equity given by the pot odds. And a little example again, so if we decide to want to call off a 20 big blind jam out of the button and we're sitting in the big blind, we are getting around about 1.15 to 1 odds. And when the displayed bounty power, for example, is 1, this would be, by the way, yellow coded, then we open our drop down menu, we see, okay, bounty power of 1 decreases this equity by around about 5.1%. So we can in the end call off a range in which every combination has at least 41.4 equity against all in jamming range. So the bounty power is like the counterpart to the risk premium. The risk premium, if you remember, is the equity increase caused by the ICM influence. So you have to put additional equity on top on the equity which you are getting from pot odds caused by ICM. And the bounty power is like the counterpart. It shows you the decrease of equity needed because of the bounty's influence, so the bounty's value. And for risk premium, you cannot do this in-game because you, for example, would need the information of the payout structure. And this is nothing which you can find in a simple hand history, so you won't find this inside of a HUD. But for the stat of the bounty power, we can actually use every information given inside of the hand history. And so we can display in-game how big the equity drop will be. Now let's start off with some observations. So the first observation will be when we are comparing situations with different stack sizes, but similar effective stack sizes. And then we will notice that the equities which we'll need to call off and all in will differ. So I give you two examples. In this table, you see the bounty size in starting bounties on the left side. So this is essentially the bounty which you can win. In a $100 PKO, 1 would be $25, 1.5 would be $37.5, 2 would be $50, and so on. And this is the stack sizes which we want to look at. The big blind should be 1/10 of a starting stack. So the blinds in this case are 500, 250, and 50. And in this stage of the tournament, round about 80% of the bounty prize pool is left. So when you have 20 big blinds, 20 divided by 10 is exactly 2 starting stacks. So you would have 10,000 chips in this case. Now you can calculate all the equities for the case that you want to call off and all in the big blind. So a 28 big blind stack jams, he has 3 starting bounties, then you need 41.1% in the big blind to call off the all-in versus the opponent's open jamming range. Now we compare this scenario where we have 2 starting bounties to a different scenario where the big blind should be 1/3 of the starting stack. And in this case, we divide 20 by 3, so we get something around 7 starting stacks, and this is a bit under 35,000. So those two situations are actually, from the effective stack sizes, the same. So you have 20 big blinds here and you have 20 big blinds here. And now if you're looking at the scenario that you want to call off a player who has 20 big blinds and 1 starting bounty, in the case where he has only 2 starting stacks and chips, you need 43% to call off the all-in. And in the case where he has 20 big blinds but round about 7 starting stacks, you need 44.9% to call off the all-in. And you have a 2% equity difference. This equity difference seems rather small. You can find a lot of different scenarios where the difference is actually way higher. So for example, take the 25 big blind open jam and 3 starting bounties. In the case where this is 2.5 starting stacks, you need 40.2% to call off the all-in. And in the case where you have 25 big blinds and the blinds are actually way bigger, so this is a bit over 8 starting stacks, so 8.33 starting stacks to be exact, you need in the same situation 44.3%. So this is the difference of 4% equity, and this is actually a lot. So this is the first observation. When stack size compared to the starting stack is big compared to the bounty, then the needed equity will increase and the effective equity drop will diminish. So this is exactly what we observed. The equity drop will differ for different scenarios of stack size compared to the bounty size of the actual player. And again, I give you the example where we have the big blind is 1/10 of a starting stack. So for example, for 5,000 starting stack, 500, 250 and 50. And again, 80% of the bounty price pool is left. And now we just calculate the equity drop. And the color coding gives you the equity drop. So for the red coding, the equity drop is lower than 3% compared to the equity which we are getting out of the pot odds. The yellow coding is in between 3 and 8%, and the green coding is in between 8 and 50%. And when we compare this again to the scenario where the big blind was 1/3 of a starting stack, so the stack sizes are effectively the same, but the amount of chips compared to the starting stack is way higher, then we will see that the equity drop will change drastically. So for the same amount of bounties and same amount of effective stack sizes, you now have a huge area where the equity drop is actually below 3% and the rest of the area is in between 3 and 8% equity drop. Meanwhile, already for the case that you have 20 big blinds and 3 bounties, in the case that blinds are small, so the stacks are effectively small, you have more than 8% for this case, and here you have a maximum of 3% decrease. So this is a big difference. So our conclusion is rather simple. If you have to risk several starting stacks to win 1 or 2 starting bounties, then the deal is not very good. And so the equity drop caused by the bounty is also not very big compared to the equity which you are getting out of the pot odds. But if you can win several bounties, the required equity will drop substantially. So if you, for example, have to risk 1 starting stack to win 1 starter bounty, you're a lot of the times in the middle of the range of the equity drop. So you're in the yellow area in between 3 and 8% equity drop. If you have to risk, let's say, 0.5 starting stacks to win 1 starter bounty, you are a lot of the times in the high range of the equity drop. So in the green area, where you're over 8% equity drop 12%, 15% equity drop, where you will have most of the time call any two. If you have to risk 2 starting stacks to win 1 start bounty, you're a lot of the times in a very low range of the equity drop, so in the red area where the equity is nearly the same as the equity which you're getting out of the pot odds. So all those equities are calculated with our calculation tool online. Everything is double checked with Hold'em Resources calculator, so the numbers are consistent and the resulting ranges are also consistent. And what you have to take also in consideration that when different big blind sizes in the tournament occur, so if you're looking at different situations, for 1/10 of a starting stack, the big blind 500, 250 and 50, or 1/3 of a starting stack, so essentially 1650, 825, 165, for example, then you will have to take into account that those different big blind sizes are at different stages of the tournament, and it's most likely that some more players did drop out at, let's say, 1600, 800, 160 compared to the big blind size 250, 125 and 25. So in the first scenario, of course, way less players are remaining in the tournament. And this we want to also take into account, that the bounty prize pool progresses at different big blind sizes. Let's go over to the construction now of the bounty power stat. So we got a lot of information which we put inside of our index and get a very simple number and a very simple conclusion out of this. And what we have seen out of our observation is that we will have to deal with relations. So the first relation would be the current stack to the starting stack. We've seen that if we risk a lot of starting stacks to win little amount of bounty, then the equity drop is not very high. So we will need the relation of the current stack to the starting stack. Also, we saw that the other way around is also valid. So if the bounty compared to the start bounty is pretty big, but the stack to the starting stack relation is very small, then the equity drop is very substantial. So we will need this relation as well, the actual bounty compared to the start bounty at the very start of the tournament. And then we've seen that the relation of both to each other is also very important. So we cannot look at both relations separately. We have to put them together. And for the construction of the bounty power stat, we want to have some conditions. So the first condition should be that if we are risking some starting stack to call off an all-in, but there are only 1 or 2 bounties to be won, the bounty power value should be small since the equity drop is small. We want to have this easy connection, small number, small equity drop. On the counterpart, if we have to risk a smaller stack and, for example, 1 or 2 start bounties can be won, the bounty power should be big since the equity drop is big. So for example, if we are risking 0.5 starting stacks and can win 2 start bounties, then of course the equity drop should be substantial and the bounty power number which we are getting inside of the HUD should be displayed as a big number. Third condition is that if we have to risk some starting stacks, so the start scenario is the same as here, but we can win more bounties, then of course the bounty power number should be bigger compared to the first scenario where we can only 1 or 2 start bounties. And we can put actually everything together in a simple definition. So the simple definition of the bounty power now would be that we are taking the actual bounty size, dividing this by the starting bounty size. So for example, in a $100 PKO, the starting bounty size would be $25. If we can win now, for example, $50, so 2 start bounties, then this would be 2. And we divide this relation, bounty to starting bounty size, by the relation stack size to starting stack size. So we are looking at the actual stack size on the table. We divide this by the starting stack and we get also a relation. And we divide those two relations by each other. Let's continue the construction with some examples. So For example, if we are risking 5 starting stacks, but there is only one bounty to be won, the bounty power should be small, since the equity drop, of course, is small. And if we put in the numbers, so we are winning one bounty, so this is 1 divided by 1 start bounty divided by the start bounty, and we are risking, for example, 5 starting stacks, then our bounty power is 0.2. So for this scenario where the equity drop is small, our number is actually small. When we are risking, for example, a starting stack and we can win 2 start bounties, then the bounty power number should be big, since the equity drop is big. And we are winning 2 start bounties, so this is the relation of the bounties, and we are risking a starting stack, so this is 1 divided by 1, and the bounty power is 2. So this is substantially higher than the first case. And our third condition was that if we are risking the same amount of starting stacks for the third scenario and the first scenario, but in the third scenario we can win more bounties, then the bounty power should also be bigger compared to the first scenario. So in this case we are winning 5 starting bounties and we are risking 5 starting stacks, and then the bounty power is 1, which is of course bigger than 0.2. So from the construction, this is very simple. We just take two relations, divide them by each other, and we get a number. Now we have to associate the number with the equity drop. And we again take the example with the big blind of the 1/10 of a starting stack, where 80% of the bounty price should be left. And again, you get the color coding with the connected equity drop. And now we calculate the bounty powers for every scenario. So we have a stack size, we have a bounty, and we can do the calculation for the bounty power and we get a number. So on the right side, I did already do the color coding for the bounty power. So the number here is the relation between the stack size and the bounty, and the color coding should reflect the equity drop. And then we can set borders for the bounty power. So we can say, okay, if we have a bounty power which is 0.5 or lower, then the equity drop is 3% or lower. If we have a bounty power in between 0.5 and 1.7, then the equity drop is in between 3 and 8%. If we have a bounty power which is 1.7 or higher, then we have an equity drop in between 8 and 50%. And from the construction later on, you will see that the color coding is actually working very well. And on the next slides, I will show you how the exact relation between the bounty power number and the equity drop is done. So this is not a pinpoint equity drop, but the range what you will get out of the bounty power. So the bounty power is giving you an equity drop range. This range is rather small, but I want to give you a short example of why there is a range and not an exact equity drop. So if you're looking at 0.8 bounty power, this is exactly, let's say, 5%. It's not. It's a range which is, for example, in between 3 and 3.3% equity drop. And let's look at why this is so. So let's take those two examples. We have here an equity of 41.1% to call off a 25 big blind all-in jam who has 2.5 starting bounties. And here you have a 20 big blind all-in jam who has 2 starting bounties. Why I take this example? Well, because the bounty power in both cases is 1. Let's calculate shortly the bounty power. Here in this case we had 2.5 starting stacks and we can win 2.5 starting bounties, so the bounty power is 1. And in this case we have exactly 2 starting stacks and we can win 2 bounties, so the bounty power is also 1. We can take another example where we have 1 starting stack and 1 start bounty, where the bounty power would be also 1. And now we can calculate the equity drop. So this is just the number which you get out of the tabular from the slide before. I just write down the equity drops here. So for this 25 big blind case, the equity drop compared to the odds would be 5.6%. For the 20 BB jam, which has the same bounty power, the equity drop would be 5.4%. And for the Bounty Power 1 but 10 big blind open jam, the equity drop would be around about 5%. Now let's change the blinds to 150 and 10, and again starting stack of 5,000. So if we jam here one starting stack and we have one star bounty to win, then the bounty power of course again is 1, because the relation is bounties which can be won divided by start bounty, and stack which has to be invested or has to be risked divided by starting stack. So the bounty power is 1. And in this case, if we have a starting stack, then we are of course looking at 50 big blind jam scenario where 50 big blind stack is jamming. And if we do the calculation again, then we end up with an equity drop of 5.3%. We can do this for bigger blinds as well. This time the blind should be 1,500 and 100. So essentially we 10 times we multiply this big blind here by 10. Start stack should be the same. And for those blinds, we are looking at the example that we will have to invest 2 starting stacks to win 2 start bounties. Bounty power again is 1. And if we do the calculation, in this case, 2 starting stacks, which would be 10,000 chips, are 10 big blinds, then the equity drop is 5.4%. So what you can see is that we are getting different equity drop percentages based on the blind size and based on the stack size. But we have always the same bounty power. So now you have a bunch of equity drop numbers for the same bounty power stat. And now if you take more and more situations into consideration with even more different blind sizes and bounties to starting stack ratios and so on, then you can do a statistical analysis. And this is what we have done. So we have done a statistical analysis for every bounty power value. And because the equity drop numbers are Gaussian distributed, we can use the mean and the standard deviation, and in the end give you a very good value with a very consistent confidence interval. So for a bounty power of 1, for example, if you have done all the analysis, then the value will be in between 5.1% and 5.7% for most of the cases. So now you might say at this point, hold on, the equity range which is given here by the statistic analysis doesn't include this value here. And that's actually true. Some of the values won't be included in the percentage, but let me give you a simple argumentation why this doesn't matter at all. So first of all, in this case, this is a 10 big blind jam. In the case that 10 big blinds or lower are jamming, the pot odds are getting already very good. If you are now taking an equity drop of 5 or 4.9% into consideration, you will very often end up in a scenario where you have to call any 2 or close to any 2. So the case where a very short stack is jamming with a certain amount of bounties is most likely captured anyway by calling off an any 2 range. And I have fitted the values for the bounty power especially to the cases where it's not very simple to see how big the equity drop is or what the range is which you want to call. And I consider this range in between 11 and 100 big blinds. Of course, the 100 big blind open jam is not very probable, but the number will be also reflected. So inside of this range, the value is actually very, very good, and you will make nearly pinpoint decisions. So you look in-game inside of your bounty power stat, you see, okay, bounty power stat is 1, you open the drop down menu, you see you get a values in between 5.1 and 5.7%. If you display this number with 1 or 2 comma numbers behind, and you can say very close, okay, if this would, for example, be set as 1.04, then you know, okay, the value should be closer to 5.2%. If this number is 1.09, then the value should be closer to 5.6% or 5.7%. And you will net with this percentage equity drop calculated from the equity given by the odds, you will net the result of our online equity calculation tool, which in the end translates into a range or hold'em resources calculator very, very well. So we are talking about a little EV difference of 0.01 inside of the bottom combos if you can really well translate equity into ranges. And this you can do without even calculating anything at the table besides I have a certain equity given by the odds and I subtract percentage value which is given by the value in the HUD. So let's sum up what the bounty power stat can do for you and how you should use it. You can use now the stat in your HUD to calculate the required equity when you consider the bounty influence involved very, very fast. And with the color coding, you will see directly which influence the bounty should have on your decision. So if the stat is red, bounty has actually not a very big influence. So it's in between 0 and 3% equity drop of the equity which I'm getting off the odds. If it's yellow, then it's in between 3 and 8%. And if it's green, then I should really look into this, and then I should really focus on this table. Okay, there's a bounty to be won. How should I adapt my ranges? How should I adapt my 3-betting ranges, and so on. And not only that you have this for your opponents, of course you can put this stat into your own displayed stats. This will also help you. So if you see you have a red number in the bounty power, of course, then you don't have to adapt your ranges very much. If you see you have a green bounty power number, okay, then you probably should adapt your ranges. I must say that, of course, when you're at the very start of a tournament, a bounty is very much worth compared to your stack, or is worth a lot compared to your stack. And at the very beginning of a tournament, of course, you don't have to change your ranges that much. So this stat really starts to shine when you did go through, let's say, the first or second level of the tournament, so the first 2 blind levels. And then you can just look at the stat and see, okay, I have to adjust, for example, my opening range, or I don't have to adjust my opening range. Little side note, all the calculations were made for the chip EV case. And of course, ICM can and will have an influence on the equities which we calculated. So if there is a finite two-tailed situation or a finite table situation, of course ICM will have influence and will diminish your equity. So in those cases and in general, don't forget to give yourself an equity edge, as we have discussed in the practice videos. For example, in the 5th and 3rd practice video, I remember we did discuss this in detail. So don't forget to give yourself an equity edge. I would always suggest to give it an edge in between 0.25 and 0.5% compared to the equity which you are getting out of the bounty power. I really hope you enjoy using this stat. I think this will drop down your in-game decision time drastically, and in the end will help you make way better decisions. So that's it for the new concept called bounty power. Good luck at the tables, guys. See you there, and bye bye.